August 1, 1944. Avranches, France. The narrow corridor between the Atlantic coast and the Bocage countryside. The thunder of tank engines rolled across the Norman countryside like a mechanical storm. Columns of Sherman tanks stretched for miles, their treads chewing through the dust of pulverized stone and earth. Lieutenant General George S. Patton stood in the turret of his command tank, ivory-handled revolvers gleaming at his hips, watching his Third Army pour through the Avranches Gap like water through a broken dam. 7 divisions. Over 200,000 men. All moving east. The breakout from Normandy had finally come. Operation Cobra had shattered the German defensive line, and now the corridor stood open. Bradley had given Patton his orders: exploit the gap, push into Brittany, secure the ports. Clear objectives. Measured advances. The kind of methodical warfare that won campaigns through logistics and coordination. Patton had other plans. His columns moved faster than anyone at Supreme Headquarters anticipated. The Third Army had been activated just hours earlier, but Patton drove his men as if they were already weeks behind schedule. Tank commanders received orders to bypass resistance, to keep moving, to never stop for anything that didn't directly block the road. Infantry divisions leapfrogged each other, racing to keep pace with the armor. The entire army operated at a tempo that seemed to violate the laws of military physics. At SHAEF headquarters in Portsmouth, staff officers plotted Third Army's position on situation maps using the standard reporting intervals. Radio operators waited for Patton's regular updates. They marked his expected progress based on the operational plan Bradley had approved. Everything appeared normal on paper, but the radios stayed quiet. Patton's signal corps maintained minimal communication with higher headquarters. Updates came sparse and vague. Position reports arrived hours late, if they arrived at all. When staff officers requested clarification on Third Army's exact location, they received responses that seemed deliberately imprecise. Somewhere east of Avranches. Making good progress. Encountering light resistance. The radio silence wasn't an accident. Patton had ordered his communications officers to restrict outgoing traffic to absolute necessities. He wanted his army to move faster than information could travel. Faster than orders could catch up. Faster than anyone at headquarters could tell him to slow down. By August 2nd, his lead elements had already pushed beyond the initial objectives. By August 3rd, reconnaissance units reported German forces in full retreat, abandoning equipment, fleeing eastward in disorder. The enemy wasn't just defeated. They were running. And Patton intended to run them into the ground. His tank columns ignored the turn south into Brittany. The ports could wait. Patton saw something bigger. The entire German position in France was collapsing. If he turned east instead of south, if he drove deep into the French interior while the enemy was still reeling, he could trap entire armies. He could end the war in France before autumn. So he kept driving east. Without authorization. Without informing Bradley. Without telling anyone at SHAEF what he was actually doing. The German commanders noticed first. Their intelligence reports painted an impossible picture. American armor appearing in sectors that should have been secure. Entire divisions materializing on roads that reconnaissance had cleared hours earlier. Radio intercepts captured frantic German messages trying to locate and track Third Army's movements. The Americans were everywhere and nowhere. Moving too fast. Appearing too far forward. At SHAEF, the staff officers still waited for Patton's reports. They still marked his positions based on the operational plan. They still believed Third Army was executing its assigned mission in Brittany. The situation maps showed an orderly advance. Everything under control. They had no idea they'd lost an entire army. August 4th, 1944. Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, Portsmouth, England. The morning briefing began like every other. Staff officers gathered around the operations table, coffee cups in hand, updating the situation maps with colored pins and grease pencil marks. Blue arrows showed Allied positions. Red arrows tracked German movements. Everything neat. Everything accounted for. Except Third Army. Major General Harold Bull, Eisenhower's operations chief, stood over the map of Normandy with his arms crossed. The blue arrows representing Patton's divisions hadn't moved in 18 hours. Not because Third Army had stopped, but because no one knew where Third Army actually was. Bull had sent 3 requests for position updates overnight. All 3 came back with the same vague responses. Third Army advancing as planned. Meeting objectives. Will provide detailed report when tactical situation permits. The last phrase bothered Bull most. When tactical situation permits. That was the kind of language commanders used when they were too busy fighting to file paperwork. But intelligence reports showed minimal German resistance in 3rd Army sector. The enemy was retreating, not fighting. So what tactical situation was keeping Patton too busy to report his position? Lieutenant General Omar Bradley arrived from his tactical headquarters in Normandy that afternoon. As commander of 12th Army Group, Bradley was Patton's direct superior. He walked into the operations room expecting to see 3rd Army's progress marked clearly across Brittany. Instead, he found staff officers clustered around the map, arguing in hushed voices about where Patton might actually be. Bradley studied the map in silence. The last confirmed position showed 3rd Army's lead elements near Rennes, capital of Brittany. That was yesterday's information. Maybe the day before. Hard to tell when the reports were so sporadic. Bradley had commanded Patton before. He knew the man's tendencies, the aggressive instincts, the willingness to interpret orders creatively. But even Patton couldn't just disappear an entire army. The British liaison officers noticed the problem next. They brought their own intelligence to the daily coordination meetings. Reports from French resistance networks, intercepted German radio traffic, reconnaissance photos from RAF flights, and none of it matched what SHAEF's map showed. A French resistance cell reported American tanks passing through Laval, 60 miles east of where 3rd Army should have been. Another group sent word of American columns moving through Mayenne, even farther east. The reports seemed impossible. Those towns weren't even in 3rd Army's operational zone. The German intercepts told a more alarming story. Wehrmacht units were calling for reinforcements to stop American penetrations that shouldn't exist. Panzer divisions reported engaging 3rd Army elements in locations that made no tactical sense. The enemy was tracking Patton's movements better than SHAEF was. Bradley requested a direct radio connection to 3rd Army headquarters. The call went through after a 30-minute delay. Patton's chief of staff came on the line. Calm, professional, utterly unhelpful. 3rd Army was advancing on all objectives. Resistance remained light. General Patton was forward with the lead elements and would provide a full briefing when he returned to headquarters. No, they couldn't provide exact coordinates at this time. Operational security. The general's orders. Operational security. Another phrase that rang hollow. The Germans clearly knew where 3rd Army was. The only people being kept in the dark were Patton's own superiors. Bradley hung up the radio handset and turned to Bull. Neither man said what both were thinking. Patton had gone rogue. By August 5th, the evidence became impossible to ignore. Aerial reconnaissance photos showed American tank columns on roads leading due east, deep into the French interior. Not south into Brittany. East. Toward Paris. Toward the German border. Toward objectives that weren't in anyone's operational plan. Staff officers began calculating distances. If those photos showed 3rd Army's actual positions, then Patton had advanced over 60 miles beyond his authorized objectives. 60 miles. In less than 4 days. Without telling anyone. Without asking permission. Without coordinating with adjacent units or ensuring his flanks were secured. It was either the most brilliant exploitation in modern military history or the most reckless act of insubordination anyone at SHAEF had ever witnessed. Possibly both. Eisenhower received the briefing in his office that evening. He listened without interrupting as Bull laid out the evidence. The missing reports. The German intercepts. The reconnaissance photos. The growing certainty that Patton had taken 3rd Army completely off mission and was now operating in some parallel campaign that existed only in his own mind. When Bull finished, Eisenhower stood and walked to the wall map. He stared at the red and blue arrows for a long moment. His jaw worked. His hands clasped behind his back. The room stayed silent. Finally, Eisenhower spoke. His voice was quiet. Controlled. The kind of quiet that made experienced officers nervous. Get Patton on the radio. Not his chief of staff. Not his operations officer. Patton himself. And tell him to report to headquarters. In person. Tomorrow. August 6th, 1944. Le Mans, France. 3rd Army Forward Command Post. The message reached Patton just after dawn. He was standing in a commandeered French schoolhouse, studying maps spread across a teacher's desk, when his aide handed him the decoded radio transmission. Report to SHAEF headquarters immediately. Personal order from General Eisenhower. No delay authorized. Patton read it twice, then folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. He turned back to the map. His finger traced the roads leading east from Le Mans. Chartres was 40 miles ahead. Beyond that, Paris. Beyond Paris, the Rhine. The whole German position in France was coming apart. Every hour his tanks kept moving was an hour the enemy couldn't use to regroup. But Eisenhower's summons couldn't be ignored. Not this time. The flight back to England gave Patton time to prepare his defense. He sat in the cramped seat of the C-47 transport, the engine noise making conversation impossible, and rehearsed the argument in his mind. He hadn't disobeyed orders. He'd exploited opportunity. That's what armor commanders were supposed to do. Find the weak point. Drive through. Keep moving until something stopped you. And nothing had stopped Third Army. Not the Germans. Not the weather. Not logistics. Only Eisenhower's summons. He knew what the staff officers would say. That he'd exceeded his authority. That he'd broken radio discipline. That he'd advanced without coordination, without security, without following the operational plan. All true. All irrelevant. The operational plan was written before anyone knew the Germans would collapse this completely. Plans changed. Good commanders adapted. The transport landed at Portsmouth in late afternoon. A staff car waited on the tarmac. No honor guard. No welcoming committee. Just a stone-faced driver who said nothing during the ride to headquarters. SHF headquarters occupied a sprawling Victorian building that smelled of floor wax and coffee. Staff officers filled every room, moving with the purposeful urgency of men managing a continental war. They watched Patton pass through the corridors. Some offered crisp salutes. Others looked away. Everyone knew why he was there. Bradley met him outside Eisenhower's office. The two men had known each other for decades. West Point classmates. Fellow commanders in North Africa and Sicily. Bradley had always been the steady one. The planner. The methodical general who won through preparation and coordination. Patton was the opposite. The charger. The risk-taker. The general who won through speed and aggression. Bradley didn't waste time on pleasantries. He told Patton exactly what the situation map showed. Or rather, what they didn't show. How SHF had spent 4 days trying to locate Third Army. How German intercepts revealed Patton's positions before his own reports did. How aerial reconnaissance finally confirmed what everyone suspected. Third Army was 60 miles beyond its authorized advance. 60 miles deep into France without clearance, without coordination, without a single word to higher headquarters. Patton listened with his jaw set. When Bradley finished, Patton asked one question. What did the Germans do after we broke through? Bradley blinked. That wasn't the response he expected. The Germans retreated. They're still retreating. Exactly, Patton said. So I kept advancing. That's what you do when the enemy runs. You chase him. You don't stop to file position reports. Bradley shook his head. It wasn't that simple. Eisenhower was furious. The British were demanding explanations. The entire command structure was in chaos because one general decided the operational plan didn't apply to him. Before Patton could respond, the office door opened. Eisenhower stood in the doorway. He looked at Patton for a long moment without speaking. Then he stepped aside and gestured toward the office. Inside, the atmosphere felt like the air before a thunderstorm. Eisenhower moved behind his desk but didn't sit. He remained standing, hands flat on the desktop, leaning forward slightly. The posture of a man containing considerable anger through physical control. Eisenhower didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He simply asked Patton to explain why Third Army's current position bore no resemblance to its assigned objectives. Why 60 miles of French territory had been captured without authorization. Why an entire army had operated in radio silence for 4 days while every other Allied unit maintained proper communication. Patton began his defense. He spoke about the fluidity of the situation. The speed of the German collapse. The opportunity to trap entire enemy armies if Third Army kept pushing east instead of turning south into Brittany. The ports in Brittany weren't going anywhere. The German army was. Every day spent following the old plan was a day wasted while the enemy escaped. Eisenhower let him finish. Then he asked a simple question that cut through every tactical justification Patton offered. Who authorized you to change the plan? The silence stretched. Patton had no answer to that question. No one had authorized the change. He'd simply made it. Decided on his own that his judgment superseded the operational plan. That his tactical instinct was more valuable than coordinated strategy. Eisenhower straightened and walked to the window overlooking the Portsmouth harbor. Patton remained at attention, waiting. Bradley stood near the door, witnessing the confrontation but saying nothing. The room felt smaller than it was. Eisenhower spoke without turning around. He outlined the problems Patton had created. Not tactical problems. The tactical situation was actually better than anyone had dared hope. Third Army's unauthorized advance had indeed caught the Germans completely off balance. No, the problems were structural. Problems of command. Problems of trust. Every Allied army operated as part of a coordinated whole. Montgomery's forces in the north. Bradley's forces in the center and south. Patton's Third Army as one component of that larger machine. Coordination required communication. Communication required honesty. And honesty required commanders to report what they were actually doing, not what they'd been authorized to do. Patton had broken that trust. He'd taken an entire army off the board without telling anyone. For 4 days, SHAEF had been planning operations based on false assumptions about where Third Army was and what it was doing. Adjacent units had no idea American armor was operating in sectors they thought were empty. The entire command structure had been forced to operate blind because one general decided his mission was more important than everyone else's. Eisenhower turned from the window. His face showed the strain of managing a coalition army across multiple countries with commanders from different nations, different military traditions, different egos. Patton wasn't his only problem. But Patton was the problem standing in front of him right now. What if the Germans had counterattacked your exposed flanks? Eisenhower asked. What if your supply lines had been cut while you were 60 miles beyond supporting distance? What if another Allied unit had called for fire support in your sector, not knowing you were there, and hit your own men by mistake? Patton had answers for all of it. His reconnaissance had confirmed the German retreat. His logistics officers had kept the supplies flowing. His radio operators had monitored adjacent unit frequencies to avoid friendly fire incidents. He'd taken risks, yes, but calculated risks. The kind of risks that won wars. Eisenhower's response came measured and cold. Patton was right about one thing. The advance had been brilliant. Aggressive. Exactly the kind of exploitation that armored warfare demanded. Third Army had indeed caught the Germans flat-footed and created opportunities no one had anticipated. But that didn't excuse the insubordination. That didn't justify the radio silence. That didn't make it acceptable for a field commander to unilaterally rewrite the operational plan without consultation, authorization. The Supreme Commander had to be able to trust his subordinates. Not just to execute orders, but to communicate honestly about what they were doing. Montgomery reported his positions. Hodges reported his positions. Devers reported his positions. Every other army commander in the European theater maintained proper communication with higher headquarters. Except Patton. Eisenhower asked a question that hung in the air like an indictment. If he couldn't trust Patton to follow basic communication protocols, if he couldn't rely on Third Army's position reports being accurate, if he couldn't assume Patton would operate within his assigned authority, then how could he keep Patton in command? The threat was implicit but unmistakable. Eisenhower had relieved commanders for less. He had the authority. He had the justification. One word from the Supreme Commander and Patton would be on a plane back to the States, his war over, his reputation destroyed. Patton stood rigid. The ivory-handled revolvers suddenly seemed like costume pieces. Props for a performance that had just been exposed as theater. For all his tactical genius, for all his understanding of armored warfare, he'd miscalculated the political dimension. He'd assumed success would justify everything. That capturing 60 miles of French territory would make the communication lapses irrelevant. He'd been wrong. Bradley finally spoke. He suggested a compromise. Let Patton return to Third Army. Let him continue the advance. But from this point forward, position reports every 12 hours. No exceptions. No delays. And any future deviation from assigned objectives required explicit authorization from Army Group Headquarters before execution. Eisenhower considered this. He looked at Patton, measuring the man, trying to determine if the general standing before him could actually follow those restrictions. Or if this confrontation would simply be repeated in a few weeks when Patton decided some other tactical opportunity justified ignoring orders. The silence extended. Patton wanted to argue, to defend his actions, to explain that wars weren't won by men who waited for permission. But he was smart enough to recognize the edge of a cliff when he stood on it. One more word of justification might be the word that ended his command. So he said the only thing that might save his career. He acknowledged the communication failures. He accepted responsibility for creating coordination problems. He gave his word that Third Army would maintain proper reporting protocols going forward. Eisenhower studied him for a long moment. Then he made his decision. Patton would retain command. Third Army would continue its advance. But this was the last time. The next communication failure, the next unauthorized deviation, the next time SHF had to guess where Third Army actually was, and Patton would be relieved immediately. No second chances. No appeals. Patton saluted. Sharp. Precise. The salute of a man who'd just been given a reprieve and knew it. Eisenhower returned it with equal formality. The meeting was over. August 7, 1944. Third Army Forward Command Post, Le Mans, France. Patton returned to France the next morning. The flight gave him time to process what had happened at Portsmouth. He'd kept his command, but barely. The leash had been shortened. The freedom of action he'd enjoyed during those first chaotic days of the breakout was gone. From now on, every move would be watched, every report scrutinized, every decision measured against the promise he'd made to Eisenhower. His staff noticed the change immediately. The general who returned from England was different from the one who'd left. Still aggressive. Still demanding speed from his divisions. But now the radio operators transmitted position reports with mechanical regularity. Every 12 hours. Exact coordinates. Current strength. Anticipated movements. Everything Eisenhower had demanded. The advance continued. Third Army pushed deeper into France through August and into September. Chartres fell. Orleans fell. The Seine was crossed. Paris was liberated by other units, but Third Army's unauthorized advance had helped make that liberation possible by collapsing the German defensive line. The tactical vindication didn't change what had happened at Portsmouth. If anything, Third Army's continued success made the confrontation more significant. Eisenhower had faced a choice between military effectiveness and command discipline, between the general who won battles and the command structure that won wars. He'd chosen both, and in doing so, he defined the relationship that would carry through the rest of the European campaign. Over the following months, Patton tested the boundaries repeatedly. He always pushed for more fuel, more ammunition, more authorization to advance when other armies were told to halt. He complained bitterly about being held back, about supply priorities going to Montgomery in the north, about opportunities wasted because SHAF moved too cautiously. But he never again disappeared an entire army. He never again went radio silent for days. He never again advanced 60 miles without authorization. The lesson from Portsmouth had been learned. Or at least, it had been learned well enough. Eisenhower managed Patton the way a rider manages a powerful but unpredictable horse. Firm control, clear boundaries, but also recognition of what that horse could do when pointed in the right direction. He kept Patton on a shorter leash than other army commanders. More oversight. More restrictions. More frequent communication requirements. Yet he also gave Patton the missions that required speed and aggression. The breakthrough operations. The exploitation advances. The battles where audacity mattered more than caution. Because for all the problems Patton created, for all the headaches and confrontations and near disasters, the man delivered results that no other American commander could match. The British commanders watched this dynamic with a mixture of admiration and horror. Montgomery especially struggled to understand how Eisenhower tolerated Patton's behavior. In the British system, such insubordination would have ended a career immediately. No second chances. No political calculations about tactical effectiveness. But Eisenhower wasn't managing a British army. He was managing an American army with American commanders who operated in an American military culture that valued initiative and aggressive action. Patton embodied that culture's strengths and its dangers. He couldn't be controlled completely, but he could be directed, channeled, used. The confrontation at Portsmouth became a reference point for both men. When Patton pushed too hard in later months, Eisenhower would remind him of August 1944, of the promise made, of the line that couldn't be crossed again. And Patton, for all his bluster and ego, would pull back. Just enough. Third Army went on to cross the Rhine, drive deep into Germany, and link up with Soviet forces in Czechoslovakia. Patton's tactical genius helped end the war in Europe. But the command structure that made that possible, the coordination between armies that allowed the final victory, depended on the lesson learned that August day at Portsmouth. Military historians would debate for decades whether Eisenhower made the right choice. Whether he should have relieved Patton immediately for the communication failures and unauthorized advances. Whether tactical brilliance justified insubordination. Whether one man's genius outweighed the needs of military discipline. But in the moment, faced with an imperfect general who won battles and an operational plan that required modification, Eisenhower made a practical decision. He kept the weapon, but he put a safety on it. The confrontation revealed something fundamental about coalition warfare and modern military command. The tension between the aggressive field commander who saw opportunities and seized them, and the supreme commander who had to coordinate multiple armies across vast distances. Both perspectives had validity. Both were necessary. And the relationship between them had to be managed with a combination of firmness and flexibility that few commanders in history had successfully achieved. Patton never fully accepted the restrictions placed on him after Portsmouth. He complained about them in his diary, in letters to his wife, in late-night conversations with his staff. He believed until the end of the war that he could have achieved more if Eisenhower had simply let him run. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps Third Army could have reached Berlin before the Soviets if given unlimited fuel and complete freedom of action. Perhaps the war could have ended weeks or months earlier. Or perhaps Patton's exposed flanks would have been cut. His supply lines severed. His unsupported divisions destroyed by German counterattacks that his aggressive instincts had left him vulnerable to. The counterfactuals remained unknowable. What was knowable was this: Patton kept his command. Third Army kept advancing. And the relationship forged in that confrontation at Portsmouth carried both men through to victory. The line between military genius and insubordination turned out to be exactly where Eisenhower drew it that August afternoon. Not in a courtroom. Not in a formal hearing. But in a quiet office overlooking Portsmouth Harbour, where the Supreme Commander told his most talented and most difficult subordinate exactly how far was too far. And for once, Patton listened.